European cities love to pretend that they were born from poetry. The crooked lanes, the soft curves, all that medieval charm that just looks like somebody GPS'd a drunk goat's afternoon stroll. But honestly, it's not that far off. Early streets were just desire lines carved into the landscape by livestock and humans. Until one human said, hey, this looks like a nice place to settle down. They built a house. A neighbor shows up. Then another. Then there's a cluster. And eventually that path becomes a street and an urban landscape evolves. It is urban poetry if you want it to be. I once saw this entire urban evolution in under 1 hour while flying in a helicopter over Cape Town for my TV series, The Life-Size City. The old fortified core, the grid of the city center, the green curves of the wealthy suburbs, the chaotic informal settlements, and the formalized upgrades as the city tries, far too slowly, to improve quality of life. And then I saw the vague structure of the earliest form of a city. Tents on an isolated landscape, housing the most destitute. But you could see the desire lines etched in the earth, the very, very, very beginning of streets. That's the organic chapter of urban development, the accidental chapter, and I love it. But I want to dive into the opposite, the structural chapter, the on-purpose, geometry-drunk, militarized chapter of city building. The one designed not by poets, but by engineers with rulers, paranoia, and a mandate from whoever held power. I want to explore their massive influence, often uncredited, on urban design through 5,000 years. I circled this rabbit hole for a long time before finally falling into it while filming in Barcelona. Standing in Barceloneta, the charming 18th century fisherman's quarter, I realized the entire neighborhood was really just a military move in disguise. Designed by Spanish engineer Juan Martín Cermeño, Barceloneta was built after the Ciutadella fortress displaced thousands of residents. A tidy new settlement where every street was straight, every block consistent, and every resident effectively surveilled. Now, the design is cool. Optimal density, with each building facing a street on either side, designed to allow wind to circulate and cool the neighborhood. A grid oriented to let the prevailing winds blow through, in order to also allow the sails and the ropes of the ships in the harbor next door to dry more quickly. Very, very effective. But those long streets weren't designed to be charming. They were also tactical. Some locals even say cannons were placed along rails at the far end to fire down the axis in the event of an uprising. Maybe true, maybe folklore, but the fact that the story exists tells you everything about the neighborhood's logic. Barceloneta wasn't born cute, it was born paranoid. And this is not an isolated story. Every civilization that reached a certain scale invented the grid system because it solves universal problems. It controls space, organizes people, simplifies defense, standardizes administration, and encodes ideology. Cosmic, imperial, military. Sometimes all at once. So let's go there, not into the fortifications themselves, but into the cities behind them, into the urban planning shaped by people who fully expected incoming artillery or invasion. I had planned to start with the Romans, but in order to get to them, we have to pass through a man who effectively gave Europe permission to think in straight lines. Greek orthogonal urbanism, Hippodamian planning, 5th century BCE. Ancient Greece gets romanticized for democracy and marble, but under all that theater, the Greeks were laying the foundations for Europe's favorite urban weapon, the grid. And the hype man behind it was Hippodamus of Miletus, the guy who looked at messy settlements and thought, yeah, absolutely not. Let's introduce geometry before someone gets hurt. Born around 498 to 490 BCE, Hippodamus was part urban theorist, part political scientist, part man ranting in the agora about how everyone else was doing cities wrong. He imagined ideal populations, clean divisions of land, sacred, public, private, and cities arranged in neat orthogonal clarity. The ideal population he proposed? 10,000 free men. Oh, and 40,000 women, children, and slaves thrown in for good measure. According to Aristotle, he was the pioneer of European urban planning. Not a military engineer, but his logic came from the same place. Order, legibility, movement, logistics, control. You're going to hear that word a lot in this piece. Control. The Greeks loved it, not because they suddenly discovered minimalism, but because they ran city-states like competitive startups, constantly looking for an edge. And what gives you an edge? A city that actually functions when you need to mobilize your citizens, store grain, deploy soldiers, or conduct state business without tripping over goat paths. He gives Europe the Hippodamian plan. Rational grids, organized districts, wide straight streets for troops, carts, and crowds. Cities like Miletus, Piraeus, and especially Rhodes became prototypes. Rhodes wasn't a haphazard town. It was founded deliberately in 408 BCE by 3 cities on the island merging to form a modern, defensible, strategically located capital. They wanted a city that projected unity, order, and strength, a fresh capital that could compete with the likes of Athens, not a patchwork of old settlements. Hippodamus delivered geometry as statecraft. And even though he didn't invent grids, older civilizations beat him to it, and we'll get into that later on. He normalized them in Europe. He turned orthogonal planning into ideology, into a system, into an export. And once you have that, every military engineer who comes later on has a starting point. Clarity, predictability, control. This is why Hippodamus is our doorway into the European side of this story. Roman castrumentation, Castrum plan, 3rd century BCE and onward. So let's go to Rome. Ah yes, the Romans, the obsessive neat freaks with spears who took Hippodamus's tidy little idea and turned it into an imperial operating system. The Romans didn't adopt the grid, they weaponized it. The Castrum, the Roman military camp, was the original flat-pack city. Surveyors and engineers marched with the legions, ready to stake out an instant orthogonal plan anywhere from the Sahara to Scotland. Cardo, the north-south streets, were like the spine, and Decumanus, the east-west streets, they're like the rib cage. All at right angles. Barracks here, command center there. Granaries, workshops, baths, always in the same place, because predictability is efficiency, and efficiency is power. And when the army moved on for whatever reason, the camp stayed. Merchants moved in, veterans retired there, and suddenly you have Turin, Cologne, Florence, Timgad, cities built on military templates. I had never heard of Timgad before researching this piece. It's in Algeria, and it's a magnificent example of a Roman castrum. Check it out. But yeah, Rome didn't just conquer land, it branded it. Castrum grid became a signature. Urban planning became a military operation. Every street, every block, every function serving movement, supply, defense, administration. Even rural landscapes weren't safe. Centuriation carved farmland into perfect squares across entire regions. The Romans looked at nature and said, yeah, that's cute. Wrong. And then they redrew it. Hippodamus provided the idea, Rome provided the hardware, the training manual, and the distribution network. When Rome collapses, the geometry goes underground, forgotten but not gone. A buried urban landmine waiting to detonate in the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovers the joy of right angles and cities that behave themselves. Bastide Urbanism, medieval France, 13th, 14th century. Before Europe starts drawing star-shaped death flowers around its towns, we get a strange, brilliant medieval interlude, the Bastide. Think of a Bastide as a 13th century starter city, a prepackaged, gridded town launched by kings, nobles, bishops, and warlords who needed people, taxes, and strategic footholds yesterday. Most medieval towns grow from markets, monasteries, or random country roads. The Bastides are the exception. They are so very on purpose and calculated. They appear mainly in southwestern France in the 1200s and 1300s. Places like Montpazier, Aigues-Mortes, Libourne. They're not accidents, they are implants. The logic is simple. You're a ruler. You want a loyal population on a contested frontier. You want tax and trade revenue. So you build a town from scratch on a grid with a perfect central market square. And then you lure settlers in with legal privileges and tax breaks. Basically the medieval equivalent of free Wi-Fi and 6 months of Netflix. The military angle is baked in. Bastides were designed to sit on borders between rival powers. The grid makes them easy to patrol and supply. The central square doubles as a mustering ground. Straight streets deny attackers the cover of crooked alleys. Gates, walls, watchpoints, they're all placed exactly where planners want them and need them. It's military administrative urbanism before gunpowder turns everything insane. No star forts yet, no cannons, no engineers drawing endless triangles. Just the recognition that order is stability, stability is power, and power is revenue.
Textbooks like to call Bastides market towns, which is fair. But in the Middle Ages, commerce is security. A populated trading town is a buffer, a living fortification. People equals defense. Markets equals loyalty. Grids equals control. Walk into Montpellier today, a perfect square plaza with arcades, straight streets radiating out. It feels almost suspiciously modern. It's medieval urbanism in proto-Enlightenment underwear. So in our grand military urbanism timeline, Bastides are the moment one corner of Europe pauses and tries something new. Not just wall mania, but new towns founded with rationality, law, and quiet militarism fused together.
And then what happens? Gunpowder arrives from Asia via the Arab world and blows a hole straight through Europe's urban ego. Panic ensues, and out of that panic comes one of the most dramatic planning revolutions in history. The city itself becomes a weapon.
Trace Italienne, Italian Bastion System, 16th century. Rome collapses, the Bastides flicker for a century or so, and then Europe spends a few hundred years in wool cloaks making decisions based mostly on faith and fever dreams. Cities grow messy again. Medieval walls, yeah, they still work, but only as long as the attacker shows up with enthusiasm rather than artillery. And then, gunpowder arrives and instantly ruins this comfort zone. Suddenly, every prince, duke, and pope is hiring engineers who draw cities like they're designing origami Death Stars. Those proud medieval stone walls, oh my god, adorable, decorative, completely useless. This is when cities mutate. If the Romans industrialized the grid, the Italians now weaponize geometry itself. Enter the Trace Italienne, the star fort system. Not a fort, a mathematical counter-argument to cannon. Low, angled walls that shrug off cannonballs, triangular bastions with no blind spots, overlapping fire like a Renaissance EDM festival of ballistic anxiety. Cities suddenly look like geometry teachers had a shared psychotic episode. Italian engineers, Sangallo, San Michele, Tartaglia, become Europe's rock stars. Kings, dukes, popes, and warlords start throwing money at them like they're booking Taylor Swift. If you don't upgrade your city at that time, you're basically volunteering for conquest. But the real twist? Rebuilding the perimeter meant reorganizing the entire city inside it. Gates move, roads realign, harbors shift. The whole urban organism reshapes itself around defensive math. Inside the walls, you begin to see 90-degree logic, clear hierarchies, street alignments designed for troop movement, visibility as ideology. Now, of course, some Trace Italienne cities are round, and they feature radial layouts. The most famous example is Palma Nova in Italy, but still, the same structure and order applies. This is urban planning dragged into modernity by military trauma. And the Italians, they don't keep it to themselves. They export the whole thing like Renaissance influencers selling geometry subscriptions. Engineers traveled, princes hired them, students copied them. Cities across Europe morph into defensive origami. Verona, Antwerp, Pamplona, and so many more.
Yep, this is the moment when the military engineer becomes Europe's default urban planner. Not the priests, not the guilds, not the merchants, engineers. Because artillery is terrifying and geometry is suddenly the only language that everyone speaks.
Trans-European bastion innovation, 16th and 17th century. Once the Italians invent the Trace Italienne, Europe doesn't just adopt it, it becomes obsessed with iterating, tweaking, and supercharging it. And nowhere does this experimentation explode more dramatically than in the Low Countries, which turn into the continent's accidental fortification laboratory. Why? Because the region is flat and hard to defend, strategic, and it's constantly at war. If you want to test fortifications in real time, you build them in the Netherlands, the same way car companies test prototypes in the desert. There are over 90 star forts in the country. Coevorden, Bortange, Nijmegen, Groningen. These cities become live-fire design studios. Dutch engineers push the system to extremes. Water integrated into defenses, multi-layered moats, hornworks, crownworks, experimental earthworks, overlapping fire geometry that makes your head hurt. The star fort stops being a cool idea. It has become a continental language, and it spreads fast. Spanish engineers deploy the system across the Iberian frontier and into the Americas. Habsburg engineers build massive fortified circuits from Milan to the Balkans. Savoy, Portugal, German principalities, everyone grabs an Italian-trained or Dutch-seasoned engineers the way modern cities hire consultants. By 1600, Europe had learned one essential truth. Geometry is survival. If your bastions aren't angled sharply and thick enough to host a family picnic, your city is toast.
The Italians invent the star fort. The Dutch stress-tested it in their swampy R&D war laboratory. And then a guy shows up and just looks at this whole chaotic European experiment and says, "Okay, children, sit down. We're going to do this properly." A man who will take scattered innovations, harmonize them, and build a unified, centralized, state-level system out of them. His name? Sébastien le Prestre de Vauban. And he's about to turn this pan-European frenzy into the most elegant military urbanism machine Europe has ever seen.
The Vauban System, France, 17th century. Vauban, engineer, strategist, bureaucratic genius, becomes Louis XIV's favorite problem solver. Vauban doesn't just design forts, he designs a national defensive organism. He takes the messy fortification craze and turns it into a unified, elegant, rational machine. Standardized bastion shapes, calibrated angles, glacis so perfectly graded they feel landscaped. Every hornwork, ravelin, covertway, and approach calculated to the centimeter. Every vantage point predetermined. Living diagrams of his mind, snowflake geometry containing entire urban systems. Vauban's genius isn't only the star-shaped shell, it's also the city inside it. He viewed civilian infrastructure as closely connected to military effectiveness. He designed streets, gates, plazas, and infrastructure with the same military precision. Civilians move through space formatted for troops. Harbors align with troop logistics. Markets and barracks coexist like choreography. Under Vauban, urbanism becomes a branch of the state, a bureaucratic weapon. France is defended and administered by geography. Everybody copies him, even his enemies. But Vauban is the apex of European military urbanism. The moment artillery science, geometry, state power, and planning fuse into one enormous defensive spreadsheet. In the course of his career, Vauban supervised or designed the building of more than 300 separate fortifications. By his own estimate, he supervised more than 40 sieges from 1653 to 1697. He also founded the French Royal Corps of Military Engineers. Yeah, this guy took his work seriously. And when the cannon smoke clears, the legacy of Vauban is everywhere. In orthogonal grids, in defensive perimeters that later become boulevards, in city gates that become monuments, in rings of walls that turn into ring roads, in the idea that cities should be legible, ordered, predictable, and strategic.
While France perfects the walled city, Spain is doing something radically different with its growing empire. Instead of fortifying Europe, Spain begins exporting city templates across continents. Not forts, cities, grids, administrative capital, starter kits. This is where the story jumps continents, from European battlefields to an urban blueprint that serves the European invasion of the Americas and Asia. Let's talk about the most widespread, influential, bureaucratic form of militarized planning the world had ever seen.
Laws of the Indies, Spanish Empire, 1500s to 1800s. When Spain realized it was suddenly responsible for running half a hemisphere, it also realized something else. You can't run a global empire with cities that grow like spilled porridge. You need order, replication, predictability, control. So in 1573, King Philip II signs the Leyes de Indias, the Laws of the Indies, Europe's first universal instructions for building cities. Not advice, instructions, a planning code with imperial teeth. Square plaza in the middle, orthogonal grid radiating from it, administrative buildings facing the plaza, church placed for maximum symbolic dominance, government quarter positioned for visibility and authority, street widths calibrated, blocks allocated with relentless standardization. This isn't Enlightenment humanism. This is military administration sneaking into the world wearing legal robes. And the result? Cities across continents that look like siblings. Lima, Buenos Aires, Bogotá, Puebla, Quito, Santiago, La Paz, Manila, Montevideo, places that look uncannily similar despite being thousands of kilometers apart. And yeah, that's exactly the point. A recognizable grid and typology means recognizable power. Spain isn't just building cities, it's building compliance. The plaza becomes the imperial stage. The streets become surveillance corridors. Orientation becomes theology meets statecraft. This is military urbanism scaled up to empire size, not with bastions, but with paperwork and geometry. Vauban perfected the fortified city. Spain, they perfected the colonial, governable one. Dutch amphibious defense urbanism, 1500s to the 1700s. While Spain is stamping out administrative grids across the world, the Dutch are doing something far stranger, building land and then militarizing it. The Low Countries weren't blessed with geography, so they engineered their own geography. And in the 1500s and 1600s, water and war merge into one discipline. Here, fortifications aren't just walls and bastions, they're hydraulic machines. Moats, canals, sluices, dikes, all choreographed to flood entire regions on command. Cities like Bortange, Coevorden, Naarden, Willemstad, and Hulst, they become laboratories where star fort geometry merges with water management. It's defensive choreography, with the landscape as a co-conspirator. Enemy approaching? Open the gates, drown the battlefield. Enemy gone? Drain the water, and plant some barley. Urban grids inside these fortresses follow the same logic. Clarity, visibility, fast troop movement, a space designed for administrative sanity and military efficiency. And the Dutch don't keep this engineering fetish at home, they export it. Jakarta, Cape Town, Gali, Gothenburg, water, geometry, empire, all speaking the same language. This is where the landscape becomes a weapon and the city becomes the trigger.
Something shifts in the 1700s. Europe has spent 2 centuries building star forts and flooding landscapes. And now a new question emerges. What if military engineers don't just shape the walls, but the entire city within them?
Bourbon military administrative urbanism, 1714 to 1800. After 1714, the Bourbon monarchies take control of Spain and decide to centralize the entire urban system after decades of war and rebellion. And who do they trust? Military engineers, the only profession that reliably produces order instead of excuses. Under the Bourbons, military engineers effectively become Spain's national urban planning agency in uniform. They design everything: streets, neighborhoods, ports, custom zones, drainage, harbors, barracks, hospitals, coastal defenses. Urbanism and military administration fuse into one Enlightenment workflow. We've come full circle back to Hippodamus, cities as rational, legible machines. The poster child is Barceloneta. A rehousing project forced by the Ciutadella fortress becomes a surveillance-friendly neighborhood with perfectly aligned streets, dual-aspect homes for ventilation and control, predictable blocks, narrow-in corridors, multifunctional and rational. Barceloneta isn't alone. Bourbon engineers overhaul Cadiz, Ferrol, Cartagena, Santoña, and parts of Havana with the same logic. Standardization, visibility, centralization, hygienist rationality, absolutist oversight. This is urban planning as statecraft as well. A dry run for the kind of top-down, militarized, rationalist transformation Paris is going to later experience under Haussmann. Ottoman military urbanism, 14th to 19th century. While Western Europe is busy turning cities into geometric weapons, the Ottoman world is doing its own version of militarized urbanism. Less flashy, less theoretical, but absolutely central to how cities functioned across their empire. From Edirne to the fortified towns of the Balkans, Ottoman cities evolve under the pressure of constant frontier warfare. Citadels anchor the administrative military core. Gates become choke points that control movement, trade, taxation, and loyalty. This isn't geometry for geometry's sake. It's strategic control in inherited landscapes. Messy medieval fabrics reworked through military bureaucracy. Power sits at the center, everything else radiates outward in a hierarchy of access. Who enters, who leaves, who trades, who governs. It's military urbanism shaped not by the compass and parchment perfectionism, but by centuries of imperial habit. Pragmatic, reactive, quietly authoritarian, and deeply woven into everyday life. Russian imperial military administrative towns, 18th and 19th century. Meanwhile, Russia develops its own heavy-duty version of militarized urban planning, blunt, functional, and empire-sized. Cities like Odessa, Sevastopol, and Kronstadt are founded or rebuilt as naval fortresses first, cities second. The grid appears not as Enlightenment elegance, but because it's the fastest way to organize barracks, arsenals, parade grounds, and naval yards across vast distances. If Hippodamus gave Europe a philosophical grid and Rome gave it logistics, Russia brings the sledgehammer. This is urbanism as projection of power, grids for marching, harbors for fleets, quays for gun batteries, streets aligned for troop mobilization. It's a tradition that continues straight into Soviet-era planning. Rational, heavy, and unapologetically state-first. Tsarist order delivered with artillery range. These aren't cities designed for charm or commerce. They're strategic footholds built to project power into the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Caucasus.
Together, the Ottoman and Russian cases remind us that militarized urbanism is not just a Western European quirk. It is a continental reflex. But compared to the razor-edged precision of Italian geometry, the Dutch hydraulic genius, or Vauban's bureaucratic elegance, these remain regional players and not global influencers.
British cantonment and civil lines planning, 18th to 20th century. While Spain exports grids and the Dutch weaponize their wetlands, the British Empire develops a different kind of militarized urbanism altogether, the cantonment. A cantonment isn't a city. It's a military operating system dropped onto colonial soil, a world of barracks, parade grounds, hospitals, and bungalows designed to keep British troops alive, orderly, and, most importantly, separate. And separate is the key. This is where militarized planning quietly mutates into racialized planning. Across South Asia, Kolkata, Delhi, Lucknow, Karachi, Pune, the British carved cities into two worlds. The clean, green, low-density civil lines for Europeans and the dense, dusty, native towns for everyone else. Wide roads here, narrow alleys there. Shade and drainage for one group, exposure and disorder for the other. Segregation by street plan, not an accident, a policy. The grid appears again, but stripped of philosophy or poetry. It's used because it's the fastest way to lay out barracks, depots, supply lines, sanitation, surveillance routes, and administrative districts. Military logic without the decorative pretense. Back to Rome we go. And the British export this system everywhere. If the sun never set on the empire, racial zoning never slept a wink either. The cantonment becomes the most widespread military urban template of the 19th century. Not elegant like Vauban, not cerebral like the Greek grid, but far more influential in shaping the daily lives of millions. It normalizes the idea that cities can, and perhaps should, separate people. I'm not saying that, the British did. Again, flying over Cape Town, the segregation lines of apartheid are crystal clear. This is the chapter where military logic and racial ideology shake hands and immediately get married. Sadly. And when Europe later pretends Haussmann invented top-down authoritarian planning, it conveniently forgets that the British had already been running cities as open-air command posts across half the world.
Which brings us to the man who imported these empire-scale instincts back into Europe and did to Paris what the British had been doing in their colonies, just with boulevards and better branding.
Haussmannization, Second Empire Urbanism, France, 1853 to 1870. And now we arrive at Haussmann, the man who took a medieval city and reorganized it in the way a general redraws a battlefield. Paris before Haussmann, a tight medieval maze of crooked alleys, perfect for barricades and revolutions. Paris after Haussmann, a city you could ride cavalry through at full speed. The dominant narrative says that this was all about beautification, modernization, air, and light. Even Wikipedia still parrots Napoleon III's official line: unify neighborhoods, improve circulation, bring hygiene to the center. And yes, Paris got sewers, trees, fountains, sunlight, and boulevards. But that was the velvet glove. The steel fist was always there. What you rarely hear is that between 100 and 400,000 people, mostly poor Parisians, were displaced during Haussmann's demolition. The making Paris pretty narrative is the dominant one. It also sticks like glue because of a series of other chaotic events that all happened around the same time as the completion of Haussmann's work in 1870. The fall of the Second Republic, the deposition of Napoleon III, the Franco-Prussian War, the rise and fall of the Paris Commune. Then, France and Europe, they marched into the Belle Époque that lasted until the First World War. Haussmann's new Paris shone so bright in that golden age, even defining it. Champagne, electricity, department stores. And then nobody felt like revisiting the awkward truth. But let's rewind and consider what led Napoleon III to hire Haussmann in the first place. Historians agree that he had three motivations: imperial prestige, public health, and a crippling fear of rebellion. And the fear part is not subtle. France had uprisings in 1789, 1830, 1848, and Paris alone saw 7 armed revolts between 1830 and 1848. Each time, barricades bloomed faster than lilacs in spring. The medieval street plan helped the revolutionaries. The defining trauma was June 1848, when the army attempted to suppress a working-class revolt in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine district. It wasn't easy because of the barrier formed by the Canal Saint-Martin. Bridges were choke points and kill zones. Insurgents held the rooftops, intersections, and sightlines. The city itself became the weapon. The army simply couldn't maneuver. When Napoleon III seized power later that year, he understood one thing with perfect clarity. Paris had to be redesigned so that this could never happen again. And Haussmann was the man to suggest burying the canal in a 2-kilometer-long tunnel and placing a wide boulevard on top. So that in the event of future uprisings, there was quick access into the district and a wide street for troop movement and a buffer zone. Haussmann wasn't just trying to make Paris pretty. He was hired to use urban planning to make it penetrable. All those other long, wide boulevards, they were engineered for speed, artillery, visibility, and anti-barricade operations. Intersections built for maneuver rather than ambush. Napoleon III had no intention of watching another mob drag furniture into the street, pile it up, and declare a republic by lunchtime. Bridges widened, squares doubling as military staging grounds. Neighborhoods previously known for insurrection were sliced open with surgical precision. Was it beautification or military planning? It was both. But one of them was the engine, and France has spent 150 years pretending it was the other. Haussmann's boulevards are praised for elegance, uniformity, and Parisian charm, but the political logic behind them gets politely labeled as secondary. It wasn't secondary, it was the operating system. This was counterinsurgency with landscaping. Paris wasn't made beautiful, it was made legible. And in military terms, legibility equals control. Haussmannization becomes the blueprint for authoritarian urbanism in the industrial era. Cities like Moscow, Vienna, Buenos Aires, Cairo, even colonial capitals copy it, because the British, they recognize the trick. Wide boulevards are great for segregation. Paris is to this day the most militarized, romantic city in the world.
There's a parallel story that can't be ignored in this storyline. 6 years after Haussmann began his work in Paris, one of the greatest urban reforms in history was taking place 800 kilometers to the south. And just like in Paris, it wasn't the city that asked for it. It was the state imposing order on a place that it didn't trust.
Barcelona in the 1850s was still trapped inside its medieval walls, overcrowded, unhealthy, combustible. The city council wanted a cute little expansion plan that preserved their power and their street pattern. Madrid took one look at that and said, absolutely not. So they did what every self-respecting 19th century government seemed to do. They found an engineer with a taste for geometry and a tolerance for political backlash, and they dropped him into the city like a software update. His name was Ildefonse Cerdá. Cerdá wasn't an architect in the romantic sense. He was a civil engineer. He did traffic counts before cities knew what those even were. He mapped working-class living conditions with forensic detail, and he believed that the key to a healthy, rational, modern city was movement, the circulation of water, people, goods, and troops, if necessary. His Eixample plan, the word just means expansion, by the way. It wasn't Haussmann's Boulevard Theater. It was a full spatial operating system. A vast orthogonal grid extending into the plain with surgical precision. Blocks of identical size, chamfered corners for visibility and circulation, wide streets to dilute disease and accommodate future transport modes. Equal access to light and air embedded into the geometry. But buried beneath it all, the part nobody says out loud, it was military-friendly by design. Chamfers made it impossible to barricade intersections effectively. Wide streets make it easy to deploy cavalry, infantry, or cannon. Long sightlines turn the city into a legible surface that the state can read and control. Barcelona didn't love it at all. The elites despised Cerdá. The city council actually formally rejected his plan. So Madrid approved it anyway. Because just like Paris, Catalan Barcelona was a rebellious, politically volatile city. Geometry wasn't just hygiene, it was governance and discipline. It was quiet counterinsurgency delivered in blocks and boulevards. Cerdá gets remembered as a utopian, and he genuinely was. He believed in equality of access, in light and air for all, in fairer cities. His legacy is massive and well-deserved. He coined the phrase, urbanization. Haussmann's designs are visible from the air, but Barcelona's layout is so in-your-face spectacular and instantly recognizable. But like in Paris, you have to look at who hired him and why. Madrid imposing order on a rebel Catalan city, the state governing through mathematics. Cerdá wasn't some dreamy Catalan architect sketching a utopia. He was a Madrid-appointed civil engineer steeped in French military administrative planning and British sanitary reform. His grid was a massive piece of state-driven hygienic circulatory infrastructure, not a decorative masterpiece. Barcelona didn't hire him, Madrid imposed him.
Europe loves to congratulate itself for inventing rational planning. But let's be honest, everything that we have covered so far, grids, geometry, military logic, state control, it's just a remix. A really late remix. The Romans industrialized it, the Italians militarized it, Vauban bureaucratized it, Haussmann weaponized it. But none of this started in Europe. So let's hit pause on the boulevards and the bastions, because we're going to rewind hard to the parallel story. Long before Hippodamus strutted into the agora preaching right angles, there were cities doing all of this with more sophistication, more scale, and, frankly, more competence. Europe didn't invent order. You know what? It just merely caught up. Now let's go meet the people who first cracked this urban code.
Harappan orthogonal planning, Indus Valley, 2600 to 1900 BCE. Before Europe even figures out what a straight street is, the Indus Valley civilization is out here casually building hyper-organized, right-angled cities with a level of competence that would embarrass most 19th century planners. Welcome to Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, cities from 4,500 years ago laid out on strict grids with block proportions so consistent you could overlay a modern engineering diagram and barely spot the difference. These weren't towns that grew. They were designed. Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan rises around 2600 BCE and thrives for nearly 7 centuries. Home to roughly 30 to 40,000 people at its peak, making it one of the largest cities on the planet. At that time, Europe was basically a patchwork of small farming settlements, squinting suspiciously at the concept of pottery. The logic is brutally rational, straight streets with calm authority, block sizes standardized like they came from a bureaucratic mold, drainage systems running along every road like the city's circulatory system. This wasn't slapdash brick lane in Mohenjo-Daro. They built covered sewers, soak pits, wastewater chutes, elevated citadels that gave the administrative corps a buffer against monsoon floods or whenever the Indus River decided to act up. Even their bricks were standardized. The entire civilization feels audited by someone with a clipboard and zero tolerance for improvisation. The result is almost alien in its competence. A meticulously planned grid, advanced drainage, multi-story housing, public baths, granaries, elevated platforms, and an urban sanitation network that some cities would kill for, including flushing toilets. This wasn't a proto-village, it was a fully formed urban machine. Built at the same time, Egypt was getting started on its pyramid projects. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't militarized in the Roman or Renaissance sense, but you don't achieve this level of spatial order without a strong administrative apparatus behind it. The DNA of control, it's there. Predictable streets, legible movement, inspectable public space, an urban plan where everything obeys the blueprint. And yeah, you don't build cities like that if you don't expect to get attacked at some point.
The Indus Valley is a humbling reminder that urban order is not a European invention. It's ancient, it's universal, and often executed far better by people who came long before Hippodamus ever cracked open a geometry lesson.
Wangcheng model, Kaogongji capital plan, China, 1000 to 200 BCE. Now we head east to the civilization that didn't just plan cities, it standardized them. If the Indus Valley gave us sanitation grids, ancient China gives us cosmological militarism. Cities that align with the universe and the state, all laid out according to the world's oldest surviving planning manual. The Caogongji, a section of the Zhou dynasty's Rites of Zhou, was compiled between 1000 and 500 BCE. Not a dusty set of guidelines, a straight-up instruction book for how to build a capital worthy of heaven, and terrifying to anyone who thought about challenging imperial authority. The Spanish thought they were all fancy with their laws of the Indies. The Chinese wrote this manual 1,000 years before. According to the manual, a proper capital, the Wangcheng, or City of the King, must follow a perfect orthogonal order. 9 north-south streets, 9 east-west streets, 3 gates per side, the palace in the center, ancestral temple to the left, altar of soil to the right, markets placed in fixed positions. Every location had political and cosmic importance. This wasn't symbolic urbanism, it was a city built to be governed, defended, inspected, and deployed like a military apparatus. The military logic is everywhere, as we've seen already in so many other cases. Straight avenues, axial visibility, rectangular blocks that allow administrators and soldiers to see and move without friction, gate placement that controls who enters, who leaves, and under what authority. A pre-modern panopticon rendered in rammed earth. And then comes the proof of concept. Chang'an, capital of the Han and Tang dynasties, now known as the city of Xi'an. A Wangcheng city so perfectly aligned with the manual that it becomes the regional template. Japan copies it for Kyoto. Korea copies it. Parts of Southeast Asia, they imitate it. Because it works. It projects power, stability, cosmic legitimacy, and administrative reach. Even the military theorist who wrote The Art of War, Sun Tzu, he emphasizes analyzing cities and landscapes, implying that if you're designing a capital this ordered, someone else is studying how to breach it.
If the Indus Valley shows us ancient urban competence, China shows us ancient urban authority. A civilization that fused geometry, ritual, and statecraft into one single disciplined grid, where the emperor aligns with the heavens and the infantry aligns with the street plans.
Teotihuacan Grid, Mesoamerican monumental urbanism, 100 BCE to 600 CE. Now we leap to a civilization that didn't just use the grid for order, they turned it into next-level cosmic choreography. Welcome to Teotihuacan, the colossal mystery city that dominated central Mexico between 100 BCE and 600 CE. It doesn't feel at all like a city. It feels like an architectural spell cast across an entire valley. Teotihuacan is laid out on a tilted orthogonal grid, rotated 15.5 degrees east of true north. Not sloppy surveying, deliberate astronomical alignment. The grid ties into the sun, the Pleiades, the agricultural calendar. The whole city flows along this cosmic axis, from the Avenue of the Dead to the Pyramid of the Sun. And make no mistake, this is also military-inflected planning wrapped in ritual. These monumental avenues aren't cute ceremonial paths. They're processional corridors built to move and manage crowds of 10,000s. Visibility is total. Rulers and priests could appear on pyramids and oversee masses like ancient stadium managers. Control through awe, control through scale, control through cosmic alignment. At its peak, Teotihuacan holds 100 to 200,000 inhabitants, larger than Paris at that time. Mesoamerica is building million cubic meter pyramids and orchestrating crowds with geometry, while Europe is still fumbling around with wooden palisades. This isn't Hippodamian rationalism. This is cosmic authoritarianism. A city designed as a model of the universe, where people move like pieces on a board, arranged by astronomer priests and imperial administrators. This chapter matters because it shows the grid doing something Europeans rarely managed, merging religion, politics, urban order, ritual, and military control into one coherent spatial system. Europe won't attempt anything this cosmically coordinated until the Renaissance gets obsessed with perspective. Teotihuacan wrote the script centuries earlier. Inca administrative grid, Andes, 1400 to 1530 CE. Now we climb into the Andes, where the Inca Empire perfected a form of urbanism so disciplined and so strategic that modern engineers still shake their heads at it. The Inca didn't use grids the way Hippodamus imagined or the Indus Valley executed. Their genius was logistical urbanism. These weren't cities that evolved. They were inserted, like hardware plugged into an imperial operating system. Cities like Cusco, Huánuco Pampa, Vilcabamba, and dozens of provincial hubs, they weren't grown, they were installed. They had crisp spatial hierarchies, standardized building templates, storage complexes, barracks, ceremonial plazas, radiating road links. Everything had a place, a function, a protocol. Cusco, shaped symbolically like a puma, functioned as the empire's nerve system. Huánuco Pampa, absurdly perched at 3,650 meters, is one of the most controlled environments ever created. A vast rectangular plaza, gridded storehouses, administrative suites, ritual spaces, all organized into a high-altitude campus of state power. Binding it all together was the Capacnan, a 40,000-kilometer road system cut across deserts, cliffs, cloud forests, glaciers. Rope bridges, stone staircases, switchbacks, way stations, a logistical chain that moved administrators, porters, messengers, and armies with brutal efficiency. This wasn't urban planning as geometry. This was urban planning as territorial mastery, where the empire solved the problem of governing impossible terrain with a mixture of architecture, infrastructure, and spatial discipline.
The Inca remind us that military-inflected urbanism doesn't always involve walls or square grids. Sometimes it just means total predictability. Who stores what, who moves where, who assembles in what plaza, and how fast an army can cross a mountain range before the sun hits the ridge.
And while we're in the Americas, we have to talk about one of the great plot twists in the colonial record, and it happened in 1535. That's when the French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, expecting endless wilderness, and instead he walked straight into Hochelaga, a fortified indigenous city at the base of what's now Mount Royal in Montreal. Cartier describes straight streets, long houses arranged in rows, a central plaza, triple palisade walls, a planned city, a fortified city, a city with political architecture. In other words, the exact opposite of Europe's blank canvas fantasy for North America. Hochelaga vanishes from the historical record within decades. Nobody knows really why for sure. But for that brief moment, it exposes a truth Europeans weren't ready to process. Urbanism was already in place, intentional, organized, and thriving. And if Cartier had traveled south or west, the shock would have only intensified, because two of the real urban heavyweights of pre-colonial North America were Cahokia and Moundville, the twin power centers of the Mississippian civilization. These weren't villages, these were cities, engineered, monumental, politically charged, and deeply tied to their landscapes. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, peaked between 1050 and 1200 CE, with perhaps 20 to 30,000 residents, quite possibly bigger than London at the same time. At its heart rose Monk's Mound, a 30-meter-high engineered earth platform dominating a landscape of plazas, causeways, satellite towns, granaries, and temples. Urban planning expressed not through stone, but through earth, ceremony, and hierarchy. Farther south, Moundville in Alabama emerges as the Mississippian world's second great metropolis. 29 platform mounds arranged around a massive plaza, each mound serving elites, priests, or administrators. It's not sprawling, it's controlled. Spatial hierarchy rendered visibly, unmistakably in earth.
And these cities aren't outliers. Across the continent, indigenous North America is full of urban brilliance. North America wasn't empty, it was full of cities, regional networks, ceremonial capitals, political centers, and engineered landscapes. Indigenous North America had already cracked the urban code.
Cold War dispersal urbanism, mid-20th century. Fast forward to the 20th century. Modernism, led by people like Le Corbusier and his disciples, had already swallowed half the military planning playbook. Tabula rasa, segregation of functions, administrative clarity, cities arranged like filing cabinets. But the Cold War takes that logic and dials it to thermonuclear. Suddenly, North America is reorganizing itself around the possibility of instant vaporization. Urban planning stops caring about civic life and starts obsessing over blast pressure, fallout shadows, and how far a family has to live from downtown to avoid becoming carbon dust. Cities become survivability diagrams, suburbs become buffers. And highways, those great symbols of post-war freedom, double as evacuation corridors disguised as leisure infrastructure. And then the plot twist, which we already kind of expected. While planners mutter about strategic dispersal, the car, oil, steel, and tire industries hear something completely different. Profit. A world where everyone lives far from everything? Perfect. Sell them cars. A landscape where daily life requires long commutes on freshly poured asphalt? Perfect. Sell them gasoline and tires. A national policy framing low-density sprawl as patriotic survival? Oh, perfect. Turn fear into consumption. Cold War civil defense merges seamlessly with car-centric capitalism. One claims to protect families from Soviet bombs, the other protects profits. Together, they construct the North American suburban sprawl hellscape that we still know today. But the era's real legacy isn't just sprawl. It's weaponized infrastructure, the idea that you can redraw space to sort society. Which brings us to Robert Moses, American urban planner and public official. Moses didn't need the Soviets. He waged his own domestic Cold War on New York's working class and black neighborhoods. Armed with federal money, eminent domain, and an ego the size of Long Island, he reenacted the British Empire's favorite trick: segregation by design, just without the red uniforms. Highways weren't neutral, they were tools. The Cross Bronx Expressway didn't slice through black and Latino neighborhoods because it was the best route. It was the most politically convenient. Moses bulldozed entire communities to make room for commuters who never intended to set foot in them. Parks, parkways, slum clearance, every one of them deployed with the same cold efficiency the British once used with cantonments and civil lines. Tidy spaces for the privileged, fractured spaces for everyone else. Different century, same logic. And it became the standard in many parts of the United States. North America didn't just build suburbs to escape nukes. It built a social geography that reinforced existing power, with cars, oil, highways, and segregation working hand in hand, all paved over with the language of national security.
Well, that was a wild ride. For 5,000 years, cities were shaped less by architects and designers than by military engineers with clipboards and paranoia issues. From Indus Valley sanitation grids to Chinese cosmic capitals, from Mexican crowd control avenues to the Roman castra, Star Force, Haussmann's artillery boulevards, British segregation grids, and Cold War dispersal suburbia. The logic is exactly the same. Control the space, and you control the people. What's wild is how invisible this truth really is. We stroll down perfect grids, we admire grand boulevards, we park in suburban cul-de-sacs without realizing that they were designed for soldiers, insurgents, and worst-case scenarios. Military thinking didn't just influence urban planning, it helped define it. It built the templates, it set the rules, it has its fingerprints on almost every city in the world. Maybe we don't notice it because the language changed. It was all about hygiene, beautification, traffic flow, modernization. But behind every elegant street plan is centuries of geometry aimed at keeping order, moving armies, or preventing revolt. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Places that we live in weren't just planned, they were strategized.